Hi, hello. Welcome to this session. I'm Uli Volz. I'm not the original chair of this session, but Professor Wang Yao from Kufe in Beijing unfortunately has a problem with her VPN and is not able to join. So I will be co-presenting the first paper and go through the different pattern, and then at the end we will have a Q&A session for all of the papers. Let's get started with the first paper. Simon, can you please put up the presentation? Great. So the first paper is by myself, Ulrich Volz from SOAS University of London, and Simon Dickau from the LSE Grantham Institute. And it is on central bank mandate, sustainability objectives, and the promotion of green finance. Next slide, please. So I'll briefly explain what we're doing in the paper and then add a few theoretical notes, which will be very brief because we don't have much time here. But then Simon will take over and go through the empirics and present you what some thoughts on risks and trade-offs, central banks' involvement in aligning the financial system with sustainability. Next slide, please. So, by now there is a firm consensus, I would say, that central banks and also supervisory bodies cannot ignore climate change. And this is very clearly expressed by the work of the NGFS, which is now comprising almost 70 central banks and supervisors. A couple of years ago, that was actually not really settled. So there was a lot of discussion, should central banks address climate change? But this has changed. Climate change has been recognized as a threat to financial stability and also as an impact factor on price stability and monetary stability. However, there is no consensus as yet regarding the extent to which central banks should play also a more activist role in promoting sustainable finance. And there has been a recurrent discussion on whether all these green sustainability activities are actually within the remit of central bank mandates. And against this backdrop, we aimed in this paper to have a deep look at central bank mandates and to see to what extent they actually provide room for central banks to play a role in addressing climate and other environmental challenges. And we're doing that by using the IMF central bank legislation database. And we also look at what central banks are doing in practice. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Oops. Okay, thank you. So very briefly, and we do have a more complete discussion of theoretical issues, of course, in the paper, but for this purpose here, I just would like to distinguish between central banking activities that relate to the very core objectives of central banks. So what are the implications of climate change and other environmental trends for price stability and financial stability, directly affecting of all central banks. And secondly, we distinguish promotional objectives. So to what extent is there a role for central banks to play a more activist or developmental role to green the financial system? And we think this is an important distinction because the first is very clearly within the remit of central banks, and the other is quite hotly debated for now. I'll pass over to Simon to tell you what we're doing empirically. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Uli, and apologies for this slightly strange sharing arrangement, but I hope you can see my slides now. So yes, we looked at the mandates. So now in practice, we looked at the mandates of 135 central banks and monetary unions based on this IMF central bank legislation database. We added 9 more central banks to this, and then we identified mandates assigning an objective to central banks to either promote or support sustainability or sustainable development and growth. This is what we would call a direct sustainability mandate or objective, or secondly, to support the government's economic objectives or policy goals. This is what we would call an indirect sustainability objective. So we found that 70 central banks and monetary unions have a mandate that includes an objective to either directly or indirectly support sustainability, and there are therefore 65 central banks in this group that have well, without any direct or indirect connection to sustainability. Yes, so to be more specific, of these 70 central banks, 16 central banks, including the Czech Republic, Malaysia, Philippines, Singapore, and also South Africa, as well as one monetary union, the West African Monetary Union, have a mandate that includes an explicit objective for the promotion or support of sustainable economic development or growth. And in almost all of these 16 cases, the pursuit of sustainability, of the sustainability objective is subject to achieving price stability. And yes, then we have 54 central banks that are mandated to support the government's policy priorities. Again, achieving this is subject in almost all of these cases to price stability. So in summary, 12% have explicit sustainability mandates, while 40% are mandated to support the government's policy priorities, which in most cases now also include sustainability goals. Okay, so some more facts about these central banks. A large proportion of these 70 central banks with direct or indirect sustainability objectives are in emerging market or developing countries. And yes, so this is not surprising, because in these countries, mandates have traditionally been broader and have also often included more explicit developmental or promotional objectives. Yes, we also find no strong correlation between the inclusion of direct or indirect sustainability objectives and the central bank's choice of monetary policy framework. So there are also inflation targeting central banks with sustainability objectives in their mandates. And then what we did, we compared this mandate situation with the actual practice and the policy that these central banks are implementing. And what is interesting, but also very much in line with what Uli just presented on the theoretical case, is that there are numerous central banks whose mandates do not mention sustainability or support for government policies, but that have begun nonetheless to address climate change related risks and sustainability. Yeah, their policies are often aimed at incorporating climate change and related risks into the financial system, and often also related to the core objectives of safeguarding price and financial stability. Yes, in all of this, it is important to keep in mind that central banking activities depend in practice not only on the formal mandate and on whether it includes sustainability or not, but also on the interpretation in practice. Risks and trade-offs, well, yes, so it is increasingly well accepted, also by the NGFS, that central banks have to take environmental and climate change and related risks into account because of the implications for financial and price stability. However, there, as Uli indicated, there may be a case for a proactive sustainable development role of central banks. And there are 3 important points that we would like to raise here. First, on a functional level, central banks will encounter problems if they are tasked to achieve too many objectives and have too few tools. This is called the Tinbergen rule. Secondly, there is the danger that too much power could be extended to institutions that have on paper only limited accountability to the public. And third, the market neutrality principle exemplifies this conflict between independence and therefore market neutral central banking and the objective of somehow achieving a sustainable transition. Yes, my last slide. Conclusion. So our investigation shows how central banks' mandates relate to climate change and sustainability. And yes, climate risk can very directly affect the traditional core responsibilities of central banks, namely monetary and financial stability. Here, the integration of ESG factors into core policy frameworks would be helpful and is necessary. And then there is the second role, the active greening role. And this is more contentious because of the possible distorting effects of these policies and the conflict with the market neutrality principle. And it is therefore important that this active greening role of central banks is covered by the mandate, as it is ultimately a political decision. Yes, thank you very much.
Hi, this is, you can hear me now. I am trying to substitute for Wang Yao, who was unfortunately not able to join, and I will be happy to support her moderating the session. I'm also working at the International Institute of Green Finance as a director for the Green BRI. I'm very excited about our next paper on bank green lending and credit risks, which is written by Xiaoyan Zhou, Ben Caldecott, Andreas Höppner, and also Wang Yao. Xiaoyan, the floor is yours. Looking forward to your presentation.
Hi. With the support of the UK Pact, Oxford Sustainable Finance Programme, with Cornell University, we conducted this research on bank green lending and its impact on credit risks. So, yeah, next slides, please. Thanks. The vision for this research is this research actually is motivated by a Chinese green finance policy. China green credit policy implemented back since 2007, which established China as one of the pioneers in sustainable finance by trying to arrange banks to manage their environmental exposure. However, there's not much empirical studies on its effect on credit risks, and this paper will try to address the green lending and its effect on credit risks. Next slides, please. So our main research questions is that we're trying to address what is exactly the link between the credit risks and its level of bank level of a green loan. The second, we wanted to test whether the state ownership or the size of the bank actually help in shaping such a relationship. This is important question to address because the Chinese economy is largely reliant on bank lending, which is the main source of finance in China. and also China's gross debt said greatly as well, from 171 to 299% GDP in the last 10 years. And also the credit risks at individual bank level affects banks' financial stability and the whole economic stability as well. So that's what we're gonna do in this paper. Next, please. So first of all, we actually manually collected 41 Chinese banks green loan green lending data from 2007 to 2018. And the types of banks include city commercial bank, joint stock commercial bank, state-owned bank, policy bank, and rural commercial banks. So the state-controlled major banks are the joint stock commercial banks, a state-owned commercial bank, and policy bank, and there's one postal saving as well. So those are larger or leading Chinese central government-owned major banks, and the others are all local or regional commercial banks. Thanks. Next slide, please. So first of all, we'll show you the trend of a Chinese bank green loan. So this figure shows the trend for the bank's green lending for the state-owned major bank, which is in blue, and the city commercial banks, which is showed in red, from 2007 to 2018. So for the major banks, we can tell that the green lending has increased greatly from 2007 to 2018. In 2018, so the average green lending takes up to 8% in terms of the total loan. And then we'll see two sharp rise occurring around 2008 and 2014, which is 1 year after two May green credit regulation were introduced. So we can say the state-owned major banks, the green lending of state-controlled major banks has a huge exhibit or policy effect. Whereas if you look at the commercial banks, the percentage of green lending also has been increased, but there's not much policy effect. We can't tell much policy effect. Next slide, please. Then I split the green lending by much more detail and by the detailed types of banks. So there's some few interesting observations. So first of all, the policy banks distribute that its green lending has been heavily affected by policy. Yeah. Then for the joint stock commercial bank, state-owned commercial bank, their green loans have grow quite smoothly and steadily with a sharp rise in 2008. And then for the rural commercial banks, they only start to disclose green loan information around 2016. So that's the basic interesting observations we say about a green loan by type of banks. Next slide, please. So we use OLS with the we'll use OLS regression to test the like 1 year effect of green lending on the credit risks by controlling other bank financial characteristics. So which means we use the previous year's the amount of green lending and test its effect on this year's on credit risks. And then I'll explain the details of the other financial characteristics we controlled in this regression. Next slide, please. So our dependent variable is the credit risks, which is impaired loans divide the total gross loans. So that's we use it impaired loan rate as credit risks. Then we control the size. So we use logged total asset of a bank, and we control bank efficiency, which is the rate of earning asset to the total asset. The leverage, which is the total liability divide the total asset, and the loan loss provision is the rate of loan loss provision to the total loans. So we control the funding cost, which is the expenses. So interest expense plus non-interest expense divide the total asset. We control the regulation capital, which is tier 1 capital divide the total loans. We also control the spread and loan deposit rate, which is total loan divide the deposit. So those are the control variables in the regression. Next slide, please. So after the baseline regression, we also included interaction term, which is the green loan times the state bank. So the state bank is the dummy variable. It is equal to 1 if it is a state-controlled major banks. So we use this regression equation 2 to test directly test whether the green loan, whether the state-controlled banks actually outperform the commercial city commercial banks or not. Next slide, please. So this is the summary statistics. So we can tell that the state-controlled major banks have a larger asset, high proportion of green lending, and high deposit rate. But the small banks, it seems, have a higher loan loss provision. This is the basic summary statistics. Next slide, please. Sorry, maybe you can't read properly. Anyway, so in this regression, we test the green lending effect on the credit risks for the whole sample and for the state control major banks and also for the city commercial banks. So the coefficient for the state, the coefficient of the green lending is negative for the state control banks, but it's positive for the city commercial banks. So which is a very interesting result for us. So the result for two groups vary greatly. So the findings for the state control banks indicates that the green loan has actually negative effect on the credit risks, indicating the implementation of China green credit policy reduced credit risk for the state control banks. Whereas for the commercial banks, it actually imposed more credit risks for the smaller commercial banks. Next slide, please. Yeah, this is just the result. Yeah, for the we didn't find in general like 1 year effect of green loan rate on credit risks is insignificant for the whole sample, but for the state control banks, actually the proportion of green loan has significant negative effect on the credit risks. Whereas for the city commercial banks, actually the green credit policy poses higher credit risks for them. Next slides, please. Sorry about this. Maybe you can't read it properly. I will just present the result. So in this regression, as I said, we added an interaction term, which is the green loan times the state and the dummy variable of state bank. This result actually enhanced our previous finding, and to tell us that in terms of the green loan effect on credit risks, the state-controlled banks actually outperform the small commercial banks, especially after especially during 2013 to 2018. So after compulsory green loan disclosure regulation was issued. Yeah, next slides, please. Then
Xiaoyan, do you mind wrapping up? If we are running out of time, otherwise, that would be great.
1 minute. So that's our main finding. We did various robustness tests. Quick ones we did using the generally square model to test the whole regression. We obtained the consistent result. We then conducted a simultaneous regression as well. So because we previously used a previous 1 year's green loan effect on the credit risk, but now we test about the simultaneous same year green loan, whether same year green loan effect has a same effect on the same year credit risk, and we obtained the consistent result. We also excluded the policy bank as we distributed before. That policy bank has a policy effect there, so we excluded the policy bank, and we ran the same test, and we got the same result. That's our paper, and we produced some implications. Next slides for the last slides. So we actually had some policy implications for this paper. So first of all, we could say that the city commercial banks actually experienced economic loss because of the limited capacity, or maybe because lack of industry expertise, maybe less integrated into a central policy making scheme, and all those reasons could explain the underperformance of city commercial banks. Yeah, so that's our research. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Xiaoyan. That was super interesting, and I would like to hear so much more about this research, because of course, China being such an important market for green finance, there is a lot of knowledge to be shared and a lot of findings to be found. I'm also extremely excited about the next paper presented by Emanuele Campiglio about stranded asset risks and stranded asset transition. Extremely excited. Welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. Can you confirm that you see my screen, my set of slides?
We can.
Great.
We can see your screen.
Great. Okay. So thank you again, and let me jump right in. This research project has the following motivation. So we know that we want to achieve a rapid transition to a low carbon economy. However, we also know that this transition might come at some cost. If you think about fossil fuels, they're still a crucial input in production processes, and defossilizing the economy, which is something that you have to do if you want to decarbonize the economy, then defossilizing the economy might come at costs for firms that are then transmitted to the financial system, creating macroeconomic spillovers and so on. So what we want to do with this paper and research project is to contribute to this literature, trying to understand the nature of these costs so that we can minimize them and avoid disruption. In particular, we focus on one type of cost, which is cost in the form of asset stranding. We have an interest in particular in looking at stranding of physical productive capital stocks. So in our analysis, stranding takes the form of underutilization of productive capacity. So an asset becomes stranded when it's unutilized or less than fully utilized. And in this specific paper that I will present, we adopt a supply side perspective because we're interested in looking at the very source, the origin of the problem. That is, we want to understand what happens when you have a decline in fossil fuels that are extracted and provided to the rest of the economy. What happens to the rest of the economic sectors? So what we do is essentially we develop this methodology that is rooted in input-output analysis and network theory, and allows us to assess the exposure of sectors and countries to the risk of physical capital stranding. We apply it to data sets. We need multi-regional production networks. In particular, we use this one, which is the WIRED, the Word Input-Output Database. And we apply this methodology to compute these sectoral stranding multipliers that I will present to you in a minute. And then we analyze the results. We compare these multipliers for countries, for sectors. We're able to distinguish direct and second round and third round effects. We're able to track how the stranding propagates within the international production network. And given that of results is very rich, we're also exploring several more specific research avenues. In particular, now we're working on this idea of looking at how different burden sharing rules across countries might lead to different types of transition costs in the form of stranding costs. However, I will not get deep into this just because the time is very limited today. So my aim for today is just to give you a snapshot of the methodology, what it is and what it can do. So this is the starting point, right? So we have these multi-regional input-output databases. In our case, we have 44 countries, and then within each country, we have 56 productive sectors, and we manipulate this data so to obtain another matrix of stranding multipliers. So these elements, each element in the matrix represents the monetary value of the capital stock that becomes stranded in a certain sector of a specific country due to a unitary loss of primary inputs in some other sector in some other country. So what you have to think about here is what happens when you have $1 less of primary inputs, so labor employed in the fossil sector of a specific country, or $1 more of taxes applied to the production of that sector. It doesn't have to be a fossil sector. We're interested in the decarbonization question, so we look at fossil sectors, but we can do that for any other sector in the economy. And then each element tells us this unitary loss in the fossil sector, how much stranding it creates in all other sectors of all other countries, including both the direct effects and the indirect effects. So this is a general overview to show you the type of results that we obtain. So here you have the scenario is stranding created by a unitary shock in each of the countries in our sample. And these are just the main stranding links. So if you look, for instance, at Australia, this tells us that shock in the Australian fossil sector creates large stranding effects in China, in Japan, and to a lesser extent than in Korea and in Taiwan. And you can do this game also for all the other countries. Let me show you some more numerical results. So these are the same results, just aggregated differently. So in this column here, for instance, you see the ranking of countries according to their total stranding that they create. So these values here, say Slovakia, this 8.4 means that a unitary shock, $1 less of inputs used in the Slovakian fossil sector, or $1 more of taxes there, creates $8.4 of stranding in the global system. The usual result is that most of the stranding is domestic, and even more within the domestic sector than the mining sector itself is usually the most affected. So we also look at just the external stranding created by a fossil sector. So this is just a shock in the Australian fossil sector. It creates outside of Australia this amount of stranding. And finally, this one is a ranking of exposure. So in this case, the scenario is what happens if you have a unitary loss in all fossil sectors. So a generalized drop of fossil production, and these are the countries that would be more negatively affected in terms of physical capital stranding. As I was saying, we can also distinguish first and second rounds. So I'm taking the Canadian example in this for the next few slides. So this specific slide is just to show you what I was saying before, that actually most of the stranding takes place in the Canadian mining sector, quite understandably, given that it's the origin of the shock. So if you allow me to take that away, you can see these are the first and second and third round effects, and you can see that the US is actually the most affected country from a Canadian shock, excluding the mining sector once again. And you see the dark purple are the first round, and then you have a second round because, of course, then also the other sectors react, and you have a third round, and ultimately the overall bar is the multiplier that I was talking about. We can also distinguish different sectors. So you can see here that the most affected sector are, again, in the US, it's public administration, electricity, real estate. And this is a good example to exemplify something that we find very often, which is that there are certain sectors like the power industry that are heavily affected in the very first round. And then they're also affected in the following rounds, but to a lesser extent, while there are sectors like public administration and real estate where the first round effect is not that large, but then they are hit by multiple transmission channels more downstream, and so ultimately they usually result to be one of the most affected. They also happen to be very capital intensive. This is the last thing that I was mentioning, these cascades that we're able to plot. So again, this is a Canadian example. So you have a shock there in the Canadian fossil industry, and this is just the first round effect. These are the most affected sectors in the first round. So again, it's US, some Japan, some Korea. And here you see the strength of the stranding. I will now zoom out a bit just for readability. So I will be more selective in choosing the network to show you what happens when we include the second round effect. And this is a particularly interesting example because you see this strong stranding link that goes from the coke industry in the US to the US public administration, which is actually even larger than the first round effects. But the original shock remains here in the Canadian mining industry. And so we're able to do this kind of analysis. This is another example. This is just for the Canadian industry, the Canadian domestic industry. You see, for instance, what I was saying before, the real estate sector is affected in the first round, and then again in the second round by two stranding links, and then again in the third round by, so that's why it becomes so important towards the end. Okay, I'm already out of time, so I will conclude. Essentially, what I wanted to convey is that we have developed this methodology that we use to assess the exposure to physical capital stranding risks. And these are some of the future research directions that we're considering. And one last important point, we're very open to collaborate. If you have any interest in this research topic and methodology, please feel free to get in contact with us. And here you can also find the code that we use to perform our analysis. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Emmanuel. Maybe you can share the code in the chat or in the Q&A. This way, everybody can access it. Absolutely fantastic paper. Really, really happy that you could introduce it here. Also super interesting data, and seeing almost kind of the scary effect of the fossil fuel industry and how it affects all of us in our economy. So without further ado, I want to give the floor to Sumit Kothari, who will introduce the paper on heterogeneous actors and relationships in the global solar finance market. It sounds like a very complex paper, and I'm very much looking forward to your presentation. Are you here, Sumit? I see Sumit is in the speaker's lounge, but you might have to turn on your camera and your microphone. Sumit, as soon as, there we go.
Right, sorry about that.
Welcome
For some reason,
to this.
It was not happy to turn on my camera or the phone. The microphone.
Okay,
I'll try to.
Glad to have you here.
Quickly.
All right.
Can you confirm that you can see my slides?
We can see your slides.
Anyone, can you see my slides?
We can see your slides.
Oh, fantastic! Thank you so much. Thanks for inviting me to present our research. So just to set a little bit of a background. So deep decarbonization of the energy sector is essential for achieving the goals of Paris Agreement, which targets less than 2 degrees reduction in the global average temperatures, and this requires a vast deployment of renewable energy, and the amount of finance which has been estimated for this is between $770 billion to $2 trillion. In the last 5 years, however, annual investments have been in the order of 300 billion. So there is a financial gap there in terms of what is needed to pursue these pathways and what is actually being spent at the moment. In the last 2 decades, most of the policy instruments in climate and energy policies across the world have focused on pricing carbon or providing subsidies to renewable energy to make them bring them at par with fossil fuels, fossil fuel-based electricity, and the efficient markets are expected to then provide the financing needed for renewable energy. What is actually observed is that there is a gap in terms of what pathways countries choose to pursue, and the actual investments which go there. Now, one of the reasons for this, and this has been analyzed extensively in the literature, is the fact that different kinds of financial actors have different capacities, and they face different barriers to investing in renewable energy. So an approach which moves away from the efficient financial market assumption, which is core to a lot of literature in energy economics, is the concept of an adaptive market. Now, many studies have shown that the markets are composed of heterogeneous actors who display bounded rationality, institutional isomorphism. Their investments are path dependent, and overall the system co-evolves with the technological, economic, and institutional systems. So here in this study, we use complex systems theory to for analyzing solar finance. And it provides a rich framework for studying such phenomena where the behavior of the system emerges due to the interactions of interlinked components. So the way this has been modeled is, this is a very illustrative example, is that we start with a network of investors and projects, and then we can convert a network of investors who are related to each other because of their investment in the particular solar project. What we can also do is categorize these investors into different categories, just as shown on the screen. And these then get interconnected as more and more projects are added to the investor project network. We use this network approach on the global solar finance data available to us from Bloomberg New Energy Finance. And this is about 31,000 individual investments, over 9,000 investors, and for 20,000 projects spread globally. And this map shows broadly where the data is coming from, and it sort of correlates with the overall solar deployment data, which is available through IRENA. What we observe is that, firstly, the market for solar finance is composed of heterogeneous actors. That has other studies have shown that, but this varies very widely across countries. So for example, in the case of China, the involvement of the private banking sector or the private utilities is very small. Whereas in the United States, we find that the state-owned actors play a very little role. In contrast, some of the European countries and Canada show that over 50% of the finance in solar energy has been through institutional investors and private banks. Such differences continue to emerge across countries. In India and Germany, we have very diversified contribution of the various actors. Japan has a huge number of non-energy and non-finance actors who are financing solar energy. And in Brazil, we have a huge contribution from state-owned actors. The overall message here is that the role of financial actors are determined by the country context, the financial system, the economic system, the institutions, the socio-political context. So these determine which actors are involved in solar energy, and the composition of these actors will influence the structure of the solar sector and the cost of capital, which the cost of capital which solar developers will encounter. So having looked at these heterogeneous actors across countries, the other thing we've looked at is try to classify them into developed and developing countries. Although this classification is a little archaic, but just to look at this and see if there are actually any differences which emerge. And we see that comparing between these two sets of countries, private banks and institutional investors play a much smaller role in developing countries as compared to developed countries. One of the reasons could be that the investment risk is much higher. And conversely, the state-owned actors and international institutions such as development finance institutions play a much bigger role in developing countries. What this points to is the fact that the overall discourse in sort of energy and climate policy, it might not be applicable. What is applicable for developed countries might not be applicable for developing countries, simply because of the fact that the actors who are involved are extremely different. So alongside sort of country variations, the other variation that we observe is that different investors play different roles in different stages of the market development. So what we have tried to do here is we've attached sort of we've created a time-based measure and attached it to the investment. So the investments which come at an earlier stage of the development have a higher weight. And we have tried to do that and try to measure what is the contribution of various actors at the early stages of the development. So one of the things we observe, and which is kind of intuitively makes sense, is that International institutions, government agencies, and state-owned utilities play a much greater role in the initial stages of the solar market development as compared to what is presented in the aggregate picture. The other bit is that from an early stage, it is important that renewable energy companies who sort of develop projects and produce power, and technology companies who manufacture renewable energy components and then are also involved in the business of setting up solar projects. They are important from an early stage. So in order to deploy solar energy in a country, especially where the market is still very nascent, it is important to create an environment where such companies can emerge, and so that they can propel the industry towards a stage where they attain significant size and see a broader involvement from other kind of energy and financial actors. One advantage of using this kind of a network approach is that we can observe relationships. And what we have here are co-investment relationships of different kinds of organizations investing together in solar energy. And obviously, there is a natural partnership when it comes to equity actors and debt actors. But even within that, what we observe is that private banks have played a much bigger role globally as co-investors. They have really supported the equity investors with debt. But institutional investors, they have again high levels of co-investments with renewable energy companies, potentially investing in these assets once they are operational. And institutions, as can be expected, have similarly supported renewable energy companies. They have also induced the private banking sector. Again, this picture, if we split across the developed and developing world, changes quite a bit, where we would see that in the developed in developed countries, in the role of institutional investors and private banks is a major link. That link is completely is more or less absent in developing countries, where, as I mentioned before, the state-owned banks and international institutions play a much bigger role. The final point that I wanted to mention is that alongside differences in the actors involved across countries, differences in the structure across countries and relationships, that overall the market itself is significantly different. So in this slide, without getting into too much detail, this slide shows basically the average number of investments by investors, average number of investors in a project, and the overall connectivity levels. And this differs a lot amongst countries. Significantly, some of the largest deployers of solar energy have very low levels of connectivity, which means that there is an involvement of a large number of actors, and it's not a core investment system that is driving most of the deployment. We look at some of the European countries, we see that it is a much smaller and connected structure which emerges in the market, which means that there are a relatively smaller set of organizations who are actively involved in solar energy deployment. And this other bit shows really the diversity amongst countries, where the individual country context influences the structure of the investment system for solar energy. It shows this wide variation in terms of the network metrics. Overall, what the message that I wanted to give through this research was the fact that when energy policies are being created, or whether when individual incentives are being considered, it's important to consider the fact that the investment system is composed of these heterogeneous actors. They have their own relationships which can be exploited. For instance, when incentive structures are created for encouraging renewable energy companies, if the private banking sector has been active, then potentially prudential rules could be considered to encourage private banks. And so based on the overall composition of the market and the structure of the market, energy policies could do well with directing sort of targeted initiatives, which can take advantage of these diversity and structures to achieve the maximum mobilization of finances. That's it for me. Thank you.
Sumit, thank you so much. What a fascinating paper. Also, very surprising findings, kind of about the network effect that China and the US are so extremely similar in the actors cooperation, as you showed. Would be very interested to see the deeper data behind that, because that definitely surprised me. But I was told that we still have a couple of minutes of questions. So if you are interested in answering and hearing and posting some questions, please feel free to do so. I was told we get a couple of extra minutes since we had some technical difficulties at the beginning, and I'm very happy about that. There was a question that was posted very early, and I think it goes to Simon and Ulrich, about the central banks, and the question is, could you please provide examples on how a central bank can support the sustainable growth of a country or a union? So I'm sure you had time to read this question already and also think about possibly some answers. So the floor is yours to enlighten us.
Yes. Thank you, Christoph. I think Uli left us already again. Yes. Yeah, so there are quite a few examples. With regard to specific instruments, there are, of course, asset purchase programs that have, well, many of which have a heavy carbon bias. And there have been quite a few very clear proposals, for example, one from the New Economics Foundation with regard to the Bank of England for how to green the asset purchase program of the Bank of England. And there are similar proposals for the ECB. Then there are collateral frameworks of central banks that can be enhanced to take climate risks into account and would thereby indirectly help to green the financial system. Preferential refinancing lines or also prudential policy. There are plenty of examples. With regard to very clear examples in practice, there is the practice of the Central Bank of Bangladesh that has implemented preferential refinancing lines for green credit. The Reserve Bank of India has a similar policy in place where it asks commercial banks to allocate a certain amount of lending to renewable energy. And then there's, of course, the People's Bank of China that has been involved in a long list of sustainable finance policies over the last decade. For example, green window guidance is something through which the People's Bank of China has always, for the last, well, at least for the last 10 years, always attempted to allocate credit towards greener sectors of the economy. I also posted a link to a paper that we will present tomorrow morning in the first session, where there is in table 1 a list of all instruments that central banks are using, and then a proposal of how these could be greened. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you so much. I think that clearly answers the question, since there seems to be a lot of scope for central banks actually to do something, and they have been doing something quite actively. I also received a question directly about the central banks. To stay one more question on this topic, and then we can move to the next one. Do you think that it's better to extend the mandate of central banks with sustainability rather than to fit the sustainable requirements into the existing mandate? Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, that's the big question right now. I think, well, central banks can really do a lot already with current mandates. So I think it is not necessary in order to start things. So I think this is also the distinction we made in the paper, that climate change and environmental risks have very strong implication for the core mandates of central banks. And this is currently not being addressed. Central banks do a lot of research on this, but there's definitely a lot of scope within existing mandates to address climate change.
That's a relatively clear answer from your side. Thank you for that. Emanuele, it seems your research has also, of course, drawn a lot of interest from the audience. And I want to read the first question by John, that your research has tremendous policy implications, particularly with respect to financial sustainability, as more and more countries move toward decarbonization. What policy implications do you really kind of draw from that? Is decarbonization then even possible, or with all the effects that decarbonization and the stranded asset risks bring?
Yeah, thank you for the question. It's a very interesting one, and yeah, I'm not going to be able to answer it fully in the time that I have, but essentially, we noticed that the policy implications of this research are different depending on who speaks. The one that we have in mind is that this research highlights, as other pieces as well, highlights how the low carbon transition risks to be disruptive in some way. And this is something that we knew already, but it has become more prominent as a research agenda, because now it seems that, you know, there are forces, strong forces pushing for a low carbon transition. And sometimes I feel that this kind of research might be misinterpreted as saying we should slow down with the transition because there are some costs. That's not the take that I take away from it. It's more the policy perspective. The policy implication that I see here is, look, there are costs, so we need to be able to understand them and then address them properly as we move rapidly, as you know, science tells us, towards the low carbon.
I might want to add another question to that, kind of something that might have been clear and I might not have gotten it. How much of that is kind of acute risks versus indeed transition risks using the TCFD framework? Because of course, kind of through climate change, you also kind of, or how do you compare kind of the climate change costs and the risks that climate change also poses to the stranded asset risks? I think that's the more concrete question.
Well, you know, I can tell you what I think, but this research that I just presented essentially abstracts completely from climate change. It is already difficult enough, I find, to say something reliable and solid and using, you know, methodologies that make sense about transition risks. So to have them both is very difficult, and it doesn't really, I mean, yeah, I guess it could apply also using these techniques. We would have to first choose what kind of sectors are affected where. But this is also something that the CGE people have been doing for a while. I think we are clearer on the risks that climate change could pose than the low carbon transition.
Thank you. Sumit, I would have a question for you also. I mean, you looked at a lot of the different countries and kind of the actors and the different phases where actors play a role. Do you have any prescriptions kind of for countries that are moving into kind of the transition right now, particularly in the emerging market world? How to do it? Can this kind of be, can your paper be used to actually also draw successful examples of a country's transition and investments into renewable energies?
Yes, that is what we intend to do with the paper. There's much more detail in the actual paper that we'll write up. So a few things which might help. Firstly, the analysis of which actors are are involved in the initial stages of the sector. For example, countries which are starting on a decarbonization trajectory about now to get an understanding of which are the actors that they should be supporting at an initial stage instead of broad-based incentives. For example, in the case of countries that might not be possible for them to give blanket subsidies, and they might want to target specific groups to actually kickstart the sector. Second thing which we are exploring in the paper is we are trying to estimate influences which actors influence other actors to invest, and that could give an idea of similarly who to target, and who basically can get other actors into the market. Finally, there's one bit where we are trying to look at the structure and the dynamics of the system how the system grows and what are the factors responsible there. And so again, looking at that would be helpful. One of the main things is that because it is dependent on specific country context. What we are trying to do is group some of these countries together based on certain characteristics, which would then provide an understanding of which models are successful in which cases. And so that is something that we are currently working on. Hopefully, it will be a part of the paper when it comes out.
Absolutely great. I'm really looking forward to that. So if you can mute yourself, I think we're all hearing an echo. Thank you. With that, I'm very glad that all of us stayed to the end of the session. Again, sorry for the problems at the beginning, and best regards again from Wang Yao from Beijing. She was able to listen to the session at some point, but for some reason she could not moderate it because of her microphone also did not work, but she sends her best regards. Thank you to all the presenters. Fantastic presentations, really interesting papers. I'm sure we all learned a lot from it. And with that, I wish you a wonderful rest of the conference and have fun networking and learning more. Thank you very much.